Welcome to Grumpy Strategists, episode 39. I'm your host, Michael Shoebridge, and I'm here with SAA's Head of Research, Dr. Marcus Hellier.
Hello, Michael, and hello to our listeners and now watchers, hopefully.
Yes, so we're coming from the reserve SAA bunker, still deep in the Brindabellas, but in another chunk of that mountain chain for redundancy purposes. That's due to a massive cyber attack on bunker number 1, otherwise known as continued Telstra outages of the internet. So the reserve bunker, populated with incredible Australian art, but our real focus today is on the election and the alliance. And we've got less than a week now to the Australian federal election.
The tension's building, Michael.
It's incredible. Defence was nowhere in this election. There was this idea it might be a khaki election. Well, that all seemed to come out in the wash. It's been a cost of living and bribery election, little chunks of money being pushed out.
Lots of alleged cost of living relief.
Yep.
Most of which will end up resulting in the cost of living going up.
Yep. And also the backdrop to all of this cash splash for voters has been an uncertain global economy. It was a bit uncertain before President Trump resumed his place in the White House, but it's got much more uncertain since then. So an uncertain global economy combined with a cash splash is an odd thing. Defence issues did make a cameo appearance a couple of weeks ago, though, with the Darwin port jousting between Peter Dutton and Albanese.
The Port of Darwin issue, which is the gift that just keeps on giving.
I found that actually quite symbolic of how the Labor Party has rolled on security over this term of government. If you remember, Albanese came to power 3 years ago saying that he was very critical of that decision to give that Chinese company the lease of Darwin Port for 99 years, and he was going to end it. And then quick as a flash, over 3 years, he didn't end it. In fact, he got his department to do a review saying there was no trouble. But he found out that Peter Dutton was going to say a coalition government would take back the ownership of Darwin Port. And quick as a flash, he was out on Darwin radio saying he too had it under consideration and would think through a plan about it. That to me is just like what's happened in the last week on defence funding.
Kind of, sort of. I think we're now seeing a slight gap between the two parties, certainly on defence funding. And I think we agree that that's a good thing. We're sort of both being critics of this sort of bipartisanship, which means we all agree on everything in the defence space. So let's just let the bureaucrats run everything and we'll move on. Actually, now with the coalition, sort of a week and a half before the election, they've had 3 years to think about this. A week and a half before the election, we get their defence policy. But a key element of that defence policy is, of course, getting to 2.5% of GDP in 5 years and to 3% in 10 years. And that is, I think, a real difference with the government.
Well, you're right. It did open up a debate around, are we doing enough for our own defence? Is there enough money going into defence to do what Australia needs done? And without the coalition putting a different idea out in their platform, if they just kept with the rusted-on bipartisanship, we would have got nothing new on defence in very dangerous times. So it was a good thing. You said they put it out last week. Well, they kind of did, but then they put out the actual document, I think, over the weekend. It's 6 pages. It's got some actual commitments and detail in there besides the money. But people have said 2 things about the money. 1, it's not enough. And 2, they haven't been clear enough about what they're going to spend it on. Only it's not enough. Getting to 3% of GDP, whatever figure that would be, in the 5 years rather than just 2.5%, I think would be more appropriate. The coalition policy would still have an extra $21 billion going into defence over the next 5 years. And that's enough to get some real capability if the capabilities are the things listed in parts of their platform, asymmetric capabilities, some missile production, some drones, armed and unarmed, some long-range undersea drones. All those things would be affordable for that new money. So it is money that matters.
All right. Well, let's quickly review the numbers. So as we said, it's aiming at 2.5% of GDP in 5 years, 3% within 10 years. As we all know, using GDP is not necessarily a great way to go about this, because if GDP goes up, defence spending goes up, but also if GDP goes down, then defence spending goes down. But I'm not sure the government have said, the opposition has said they will sort of closely tie the two together. I think they're just sort of giving an impression of their policy. The only hard number in there is 21.6 billion over the next 5 years. So I've tried to sort of reverse engineer what that funding profile would look like. So if we get to 21.6 billion in 5 years, and that's 2.5% of GDP, then in 10 years, when we get to 3%, the actual cumulative difference over the decade between the government's National Defence Strategy funding line and the coalition's one gets to about 103 billion in terms of the cumulative difference.
And so just to make that practical for people, the additional squadron of F-35 Joint Strike Fighters that the coalition are talking about, what would that cost?
Well, maybe 4, maybe 5 billion, off the top of my head. So we're talking real money. So you mentioned the F-35s, because that's about the only real capability that the coalition have mentioned in their policy document. So that's not going to consume anywhere near all the money, which raises the question of what are you spending all of this money on? Because by the end of the decade, under the coalition, the defence budget would reach 129 billion. So we're talking serious money here.
Yeah. Well, they have listed things that I mentioned, so asymmetric capabilities like missiles, drones, armed and unarmed, and
so there is a policy document, and I'd say as election policy statements goes, this is sort of about as detailed as you get. You certainly don't want a white paper style document. So there's some stuff in here. So yes, it refers to asymmetric capabilities made by Australian industry, sovereign defence industry.
Now, to me, that's a very important part of this, along with the idea of urgency. So there's an urgent push to get contracts out, things that are kind of contract ready within 100 days from Australian
companies.
So there's
a reference to getting Aussie industry to do stuff within 100 days. That's a good thing.
And also an idea of making acquisition and contracting actually faster rather than just committing to some nebulous procurement reform.
Yeah, I mean, everybody says that, though. Every review says that. Every letter says that. So the proof is always in the pudding. It's a nice sentiment. Let's see. There is an interesting thing. Our listeners might recall that we've been quite sceptical or cynical about this. The government's definition of Australian defence industry, of sovereign defence industry, as being pretty much any company in Australia with an Australian ABN that provides goods and or services to the ADF. This policy says that there will be a redefinition of sovereign defence industry. So hopefully that will lead to sort of greater recognition of truly Australian-based SMEs. I think, overall there's some good stuff in here about supporting Australian SMEs to deliver what they're good at, which is asymmetric capability. So, as these things go, it's pretty good.
Well, one other thing I liked about it was implementation of this policy isn't just going to be left to the bureaucrats in Russell Defence Headquarters. There's going to be a summit of people inside government and outside government and industry types. There's going to be a Defence Capability Acquisition Council, which is, again, internal and external people, and their job is going to be to show how things can be acquired and produced faster. So I like this idea of breaking the monopoly hold that the government bureaucrats have over everything about defence.
Yeah, and along those lines, there is this Defence Capability and Acquisition Commission, the DCAC, which is apparently going to bring in experienced leaders from across industry to collaborate in this process. So it's that Freedom's Forge notion that we need to bring in leaders from industry, as the US did on the eve of World War II, to kind of jumpstart. The US defence industry. So again, I think that I like that concept.
I like it too, and I think defence in Australia needs a lot of decacking.
Boom, boom. He's here all week. So, I think, on the whole, there's good stuff in here. Though, to me, the big thing that's really missing is, okay, we want to increase defence spending by a lot. What are we actually trying to achieve?
Well, that brings me to some very interesting polls that have come out over the election campaign. There's two. There's one by the Conversation,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of its questions was, do you think defence spending should be increased? And 1/3 of Australians think that defence spending should be increased.
Only 1/3. I mean, look, we all know defence is never sort of one of those issues that Australians and Australian governments are really itching to spend money on. So it's probably not that surprising.
Well, I'd normally think it was a good thing because I'd think it meant Australians felt they were living in a fairly secure place. So, but I think Australians know the world's become more dangerous because that brings me to the other poll, an ABC poll to support the Q&A program. And it's got, back in June last year, the same questions now in April. Is the US a reliable ally? And back in June last year, 61% of Australians said, yes, we could rely on the US as an ally. Now in April, 66% say we can't rely on the US. So it's a complete flip.
It's a total reversal in a relatively short period of time. Of course, the key event in that period of time is the return of Donald Trump to the White House. So the Donald is certainly having a global impact, and here in Australia on Australian sense of security. Though it does seem to be that the ABC interviewed or surveyed a very different group of people to the conversation, because the people interviewed by the conversation are saying we shouldn't spend any more on defence. However, the people interviewed by the ABC not only said that they're worried about the reliability of the US, but they're also saying, and we need to do something about it. So they're not just sitting there and watching. So very mixed messages from the polling is all I can say.
Like, if you want to get people to say don't spend any more on defence, are you aware that there's incredible waste and delay in defence procurement? Yes. Do you think we should spend more on defence?
No. Are you aware we're spending $27 billion on 3 ships? Should we spend more on defence?
Yeah. So, but the interesting thing to me is if you look at that single poll done 9 months apart, June last year and April this year, that collapse in Australians' assessment of America as a reliable ally, which brings us to what's the purpose of a defence policy? Well, it has to deal with that unreliability. And you've talked about hedging. There is some evidence that the coalition policy is at least acknowledging we need to hedge against a more unreliable and more demanding America. In fact, Andrew Hastie said he wasn't sure that we could rely on America to protect us as we have before.
Well, yeah, it was interesting. Mr. Hastie came out and said, that Donald Trump is, quote, hard to predict. And he also said, quote, we can't take anything for granted. So, look, it's obvious. It's easier when you're in opposition to make those kinds of statements. But, the government have been shying away from any kind of criticism of the Trump or the Trump administration. So it was quite interesting to hear the opposition defence spokesman say that, particularly with the leader of the opposition standing 2 feet behind him. So I don't think Hastie was freelancing.
Yeah, well, there was no shepherd's hook that came out and grabbed Hastie and pulled him back at that point. And I think it fits with what Australians are assessing themselves. So I don't think it was a jarring moment. I think it was a moment of truth coming out of Andrew Hastie's mouth.
And it seems to me it only makes sense to spend more money on defence if we are trying to move away from the kind of model we've had for the last 50 plus years, where essentially, when you get down to it, the ADF is providing small tailored contributions into US-led operations around the world. It seems to me that we are moving to a different space. We have to move to a different space where we have greater self-reliance. You need to hedge against the US's unreliability. That's what I'm not sort of seeing explicitly in the coalition defence policy, this kind of statement that we are fundamentally increasing Australian self-reliance. It's sort of in there. I'm not saying it's not there.
I would say the emphasis on urgent increase of Australian military power, the urgency that the coalition acknowledge, that asymmetric sign and the sovereign production, all of that is hedging against a less reliable America. The bit we haven't seen yet, though, is the other hedge that you think about and I think about, which is, shouldn't we be hedging against the failure of the AUKUS submarine program? Because just looking at the compounding troubles that the US and UK have with their own submarine capabilities, and then thinking about all the additional troubles of bringing a third partner, Australia, into that, I think not hedging is actually negligent. And I've heard people say things like, you can't even raise hedging against the AUKUS submarine program failing because that is sacrilege, that's anathema, that's not believing in Australians and national will. Almost like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. If we can just bang our ruby slippers together and say, I wish I was back in Kansas, everything will be fine. You don't get nuclear submarines by faith. It's not a faith-based activity.
Well, you use the term failure. We've spoken about this before. Risk is really a matrix of likelihood versus consequence. We can have things well short of failure here, but we still need to be hedging against it. So,
what's that look like?
Well, submarines are delivered late, for example. We don't get them on the time frame we're expecting, and the columns capability ages, and so we have a very significant decrease in submarine capability. That's very hard for us to claw our way back out of. So that's another potential future short of failure. Another potential future is we get the submarines, but we can't operate them at the level we'd like due to lack of crews or things like that. And then there is also that issue of they don't actually do all the things, that big shopping list of things that people say they can do. They're not actually all that good at those things. Like land strike, for example, the number of Tomahawk cruise missiles we'd be able to launch, even if we have SSNs, is still a trivially small number, for example. And that's before we get into all of the potential futures where we have technologies that can limit the effectiveness of SSNs because they can be detected, or you can have swarms of killer drones stopping them leaving port. And, so it's not outright failure is sort of not the only future that we should be hedging against. It is we get less than we had hoped for all of the reasons I just spoke about.
I suppose I was using it as shorthand. I think even success with AUKUS leaves an enormous hole in our defence capabilities, because we don't get 8 of those nuclear submarines until 2054, 30 years from now. When you've got 8, you can reliably put 2 to sea. So I think we've got to hedge even against outrageous success of AUKUS, because it isn't enough to make us secure in the world the Australian public understand, which is one where America is no longer a reliable guarantor of our security.
Well, and another one of the risks around AUKUS that we've spoken about, we're seeing actually occur. It's no longer a theoretical risk, it's an issue that's occurring. And we wrote about this in some detail in the budget report we put out last week. So everyone out there, go and check out our Defence 2025, which looks at the defence budget, and it's up on our website as a free download. We talk about the opportunity cost of AUKUS and try and put some numbers around the opportunity cost there. And one of the little factoids we put in there is that already the acquisition cost of AUKUS, of the SSNs, is greater than the Royal Australian Air Force's entire capital budget. So we already, 7 to 8 years before we have any submarines, SSNs of our own, we're spending more on that than Air Force capability. So that's the opportunity cost we're seeing.
And I think that is extraordinary. That is an extraordinary insight to say, years before we've got the first of these submarines, that program is already outspending the entire acquisition budget of our entire Air Force. There's something not right there. One of these things is not like the others. One of these things is not the same. Something is wrong with that picture.
So we could get AUKUS, we could get the SSNs, but if the cost is we've got an aged Air Force that hasn't kept up with regional threats, that isn't developing the capabilities we need, particularly in long-range strike, then again, that's a quasi-failure.
Well, I would say this is where that $21 billion of new money in the next 5 years could make a big difference. You buy a bunch of medium range, reasonable endurance aerial drones that have surveillance and combat capability. And the next time Russian or Chinese warships decide to pootle around in our local neighborhood, at least you've got something to watch them with. And at least they know you've got some options if things were to get ugly. At least you've got something. At the moment, we've got some tired out old Anzac frigates that can't keep up. So people can deride the amount of money that the coalition are promising to put in the next 5 years, but spent wisely, it could make a big difference, and it could hedge in the way we should hedge.
Yeah. Now, will that money eventuate because the coalition government is elected in less than a week's time? Well, looking at the polls at the moment, it's not looking good for the coalition. What I would say, however, is that those numbers, the 2.5% and 3% numbers, have now been injected into political discourse. It's not just old cranks like you and me shouting from the sidelines saying we're going to get to 3%, but it's actually part of the political discourse.
Well, it's opened the Overton window, hasn't it? That thing about what is imaginable, what's the policy space. And even Prime Minister Albanese has had to at least accept the prospect maybe he needs to raise the defence budget. He's used the usual kind of words that don't really commit him to anything but make him sound like he could be strong if he needed to be. We look at the budget every year. If we've got priorities, we invest in them. Yes, of course, I'd look at that in defence if I thought it was right, and that's what we do, and we've got a plan. But he stopped ruling out increases beyond what they'd already baked in. And that was completely different to what we heard from him, Treasurer Chalmers, and Richard Marles earlier in the campaign. So I think that breaking of bipartisanship has opened up the defence space in a healthy way, whoever wins.
Well, yeah, I agree there. Now, is Albo going to rush out and spend 3%? No, but what it's sort of forced him to say is that what Labor put in the National Defence Strategy last year is not truth for all eternity, that it hasn't solved every conceivable security issue for all time. It has made them accept that they will need to readjust that. So it's not like this perfection that we're simply delivering.
And that's good, because there's been way too much of this. I brought the tablets down from the mountain. I've got this unchangeable long-term plan, and I'm just going to defend this plan to the death. To recognise that big changes in our world, like the two wars in Middle East and Europe, and the very different directions of the Trump administration, those big changes should affect our policy directions. I think that is healthy.
And it's interesting because we were talking about this before offline. I was sort of looking at all the big competitions going on in the defence space, and there's virtually nothing live at the moment. The only big one that I can think of is the general purpose frigate. So this new frigate program that the government came up with, essentially to stop the Royal Australian Navy turning into a navy with no ships. It's probably a good thing, but when you look across the board, there's not much else going on in terms of big competitions, either out to tender at the moment or coming up in the next few years. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, what that really says is that we are in the process of delivering a force that was designed a long time ago.
Well, really back in 2009, the force structure is the '09 white paper, with a few tweaks, a few cancellations and cuts, and 8 nuclear submarines bolted in instead of 12 conventional submarines. it's like a slow motion delivery of the '09 vision.
This very slow motion delivery of a plan set out a very long time ago. So I think anything that can kind of disrupt that and inject some urgency and some new thought into that would be a great thing.
Yeah, well, and the idea of our defence force in this new world isn't just a little minor plug-in to a bigger American force, and it can't suck down all the supplies from America that it would need if it just plugged in to a bigger American force. It's actually got to be able to be supported itself and do things in combat itself, not just as a minor adjunct. That's a whole new path for the defence organisation.
Mm-hmm. So that's Australian dollars. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about American dollars because
I think some big developments there. I mean, I'd start with the DOGE chainsaw. It looks like it's done its early work and it's now broadly being put back in the shed. And to me, the DOGE came out, I think they had a $2 trillion savings target, then they had a $1 trillion savings target. You've got an assessment by the BBC.
I've got this great BBC piece here, which has this nice little chart. So the original pledge was 10 trillion, which was revised down to 1 trillion. The current announced savings is 160 billion, but when you burrow in to see the itemized things, it's only 61 billion. And the ones that don't have any evidence at all attached to them are only 32 billion. So that's about 3% of the revised lower target of.
Well, I remember the original reason for DOGE when Trump and Musk were talking about it. That was the way they were going to cut the US government debt and bring it back into balance. Tariffs were going to be rivers of gold. Revitalising the American economy was going to be another revenue river. But reducing the cost of government by cutting trillions out with the DOGE chainsaw was going to be the other big movement there. Turned out if you're saving, what did you say, 60 billion or 30 billion instead of 2 trillion or 1 trillion, that tells me the swamp isn't drained. The swamp in Washington is the swamp it always was.
Yeah, it doesn't help because those numbers are not in-year, single-year numbers. If you cancel a $1 billion contract that's going for 10 years, you've only saved 100 million a year. And I might just review some of the US budget numbers just to sort of give the context of how feeble those numbers are. So Pete Hegseth has announced sort of $5 billion in savings in the US Department of Defense. Let's recall that the US defense budget is over 800 billion a year. So that is well under 1%, even if we took it as a single year number.
So it's not really a triumph.
In 2024, the US federal government had 4.9 trillion in revenue, but its outlays were 6.75. So it was spending 1.8 trillion more than it was bringing in.
Are you telling me that saving 5 billion if you've got a 1.8 trillion deficit problem, it's not a lot? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
It's not a lot. So, but the mandatory spending, so social security and healthcare problems, was 4 trillion. Okay, and the interest on the debt is nearly 900 billion.
Bigger than the Pentagon budget.
4.9 billion a year is the mandatory stuff, which is all their revenue. So revenue's 4.9, and their mandatory stuff and the paying interest on the debt is also 4.9. So everything else is essentially being funded through deficit spending, and that includes the Pentagon. So you can cancel US aid, you can kick park rangers out, you can cancel food assistance programs, you can abolish every single DEI program. It really fundamentally.
Well, one thing that is, I think, really ugly about what's happened with the DOGE approach is it acted a bit like a really nasty virus where those that caught it early died or got horrible debilitating effects, whereas those that didn't get affected early are escaping with some natural immunity now. So the State Department, USAID, a whole bunch of important foreign-facing outfits like the Institute of Peace, they've all been completely squashed. The State Department, I think, is cut in about half. The USAID has ceased to be. They were the early DOGE casualties when it was at its most virulent. And now that it's become benign, the big agencies where all the money was are immune.
Well, defence seems to have gotten off here. So, uh, listeners may recall that a couple of months ago there was this talk that Hegseth was telling the department to find 8% a year in savings
to reinvest. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's quite serious cuts. But then it's actually to reinvest. They're not losing that money. Then when you look at the actual savings, 5 billion out of over 800 billion a year isn't all that much. But then just recently, Hegseth and President Trump have said they're aiming for a $1 trillion defense budget. So that's over a $100 billion increase.
Well, that's not a saving, is it? So if you're after deficit reduction and you increase the Pentagon budget by 100 billion and you've found 5 billion of savings over an unstated time frame, you're making the deficit work.
So, and it appears that the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee are fine with this idea of hitting a $1 trillion defense budget. Yeah, that's really defense isn't giving up anything and they're getting more money.
Well, and if we think the discussion about what's the purpose of our defense force is tricky, I think it's an even harder discussion in America now. What's the purpose of the American military? It's not to underpin the rules-based global order. It's not to be the guarantor of European security and NATO's security. It doesn't even look like it's to guarantee security here in our part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, with Trump saying that Taiwan's a problem because they stole America's semiconductor industry, rather than talking about the challenge of an aggressive China. I'm not sure what the purpose of the Pentagon is, but I suspect this, biggest military budget ever language coming out of Trump and Hegseth of $1 trillion US going into the Pentagon, that to me just smells of long bonnet syndrome. My bonnet is longer than your bonnet. Donk is a 5.8 litre Hemi. It's bigger than yours. That's what it feels like to me.
Look, there does seem to be an element of that with President Trump's big, beautiful budget here. Yeah, without seeing a sort of national defense strategy outlining what the US thinks that the military is meant to be doing and what kinds of commitments the US is going to stand by to its allies around the world, it's a bit hard to know what this is all about. Though it does sort of bring to mind this new concept that we wrote about in our budget report called the Ferguson limit or the Ferguson law. And it was recently proposed by a British conservative historian, Niall Ferguson, though he's not the Ferguson that it's named after. He's named it after Adam Ferguson, who was an 18th century.
What a coincidence that history might mistake the Ferguson of that law for himself. Anyway, tell us about this, because a little bit of history can be informative.
So the Ferguson limit or the Ferguson law basically says that if a great power is spending more servicing its debt than it is on its military spending, that's a sure sign of decline.
And other examples?
So he gives lots of examples, such as the Habsburg Spain, which overextended itself in the 16th, 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire, which collapsed in World War One, the Russian Empire, which similarly collapsed in World War One. So, and also the British Empire, which essentially fell apart in the 20th century.
Now, so what you were telling me before about the interest that the US government is paying on their debt being greater than the current Pentagon budget, that would be applying the Ferguson law to America. So are they towards the end of their own time as this large empire?
So, yes, that's where we could be heading. So Niall Ferguson, so not Adam Ferguson speaking from the grave, but Niall Ferguson points out that as of last year, US debt payments exceeded the defence budget. So, the question is, the question has always been, how long can the US sustain its massive deficit spending? Now, people have kind of argued that because of the exorbitant privilege, this term that people use to describe the advantage that the US has by essentially having the global reserve currency, that gives it certain advantages. And one is that it can actually sustain all of this deficit spending, in part because everybody else in the world needs US dollars, so they'll buy US Treasury bonds.
Because they're doing global trading, and that's the global reserve currency.
Yep. You need dollars to buy and sell stuff. And worst case scenario, as the US has done at times, the US can just print more dollars and invent more money for free. So the US has these great advantages. The question has always been, at what point does it go too far? And, some people might argue that we're seeing the first cracks under Donald Trump, where his economic chaos, by announcing all of these huge tariffs, sparked, flight from US dollars, and people around the world, particularly the Japanese, were selling their US Treasury bonds, which of course forced the price down. And there's a kind of very iron law here that as the price of bonds goes down, the interest rate
of the US government
goes up.
Yes. So the price of the US debt goes up.
So exactly, the price of the US debt goes up. So one might think that it's okay, Trump has stopped the rot. He's going to increase US defense spending to preserve a strong US able to fight for its global position.
Do a reverse focusing. Suddenly I'm spending $1 trillion on the Pentagon and my debt payment is only $900 billion.
But my debt payments are going to go up if I keep destroying the global economy as people abandon US Treasury bonds. So I certainly don't think there's any evidence yet that the US is out of the woods in terms of this kind of long-term, what I'd say, relative decline. I think the bigger issue here, and it's one we've spoken about before, is that we've moved on from a unipolar global order where the US was the global hegemon, moving on to something else. But what is that something else, and what is the US's role in it? And I don't think there's been a really good discussion inside the Beltway in the US policy blob about what does that next thing look like.
No, that's right. And a 3-word bumper sticker, peace through strength, is not going to do that. We can see that with the questioning and rethinking going on in Europe, and the questioning that certainly started in our part of the world as well. Yeah, so that's something to notice. And it's good to at least see that some change to the impenetrable permafrost that has been defence policy and defence funding in Australia has at least shown a glimmer of happening through this election. Marcus, we're probably out of time now. I'll get back with the SAA tech staff and get this edited and out in time for people who've watched it before they get that election Lamington.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to our listeners and now hopefully watchers.
Yes. Thank you for your patience as we experiment with the recording. Thanks, everyone.